You close your eyes, letting the warm hush of the desert settle around you, as you imagine yourself drifting along the banks of the Nile more than 4,000 years ago. Life in ancient Egypt is often presented as a whirlwind of pharaohs, pyramids, monumental temples, and dazzling ceremonies. But the truth is that most of life passed slowly, very slowly, in long stretches of quiet labor, punctuated by even quieter moments of recreation. And it is these quieter moments, the boring details about how ordinary Egyptians entertained themselves, that reveal a remarkably human world. As the morning sun rises over the river, casting soft gold across the water, you begin to see the shape of daily life settle into its predictable rhythm. You can imagine workers starting their routines, farmers tending fields swollen with the seasonal flood, fishermen repairing nets, and potters shaping clay. Yet among these routines lie pockets of stillness, small windows, when people indulged in forms of recreation that are often overlooked, especially the slow, calm games that filled their spare hours. One of the most ancient of these activities was Senet, a board game whose wooden pieces quietly slid along carved tracks. Today, the boards often appear in museums, set neatly behind glass. But in their own time, they were little more than everyday household items, tools of social bonding, mild competition, and gentle distraction. Unlike the energetic sports that came centuries later, Senet required nothing but patience. The pace of the game made it perfect for the rhythm of life along the Nile, where time moved with the river, steady, unhurried, and repetitive. Imagine yourself sitting cross-legged inside a modest mud brick home, built of sun-baked clay and faintly smelling of grain and dust. The room is dim, lit only by slivers of sunlight slipping through narrow shutters. In front of you is the Senet board, carved with simple precision. Its 30 squares are arranged in 3 rows, and each square holds a meaning, some auspicious, some unlucky, and some merely transitional. The pieces feel smooth and polished, worn by the fingertips of generations. Across from you sits a family member, or perhaps a neighbor, who has arrived after finishing their morning chores. They settle down with a quiet sigh, ready for the familiar ritual. You exchange a few casual observations about the crop irrigation or the unusual behavior of the household cat. But conversation wanes quickly. The game itself becomes the focal point of your shared silence. Yet Senet was not the only quiet pastime. There were other, even slower activities, ones that did not require strategy or skill. Some involved simply watching the patterns of the river, observing the slow drift of reeds along the current, or listening to the heavy wings of ibis cutting through the morning air. Egyptians documented little of this in their formal histories, but you can infer these moments through their art, which often depicts people in relaxed, contemplative poses. A man leaning on a staff, a woman seated with hands folded in her lap, a child watching fishermen pull in their nets. For the ancient Egyptians, recreation did not always involve doing something. Often, it involved waiting for the water to rise, waiting for the heat to pass, waiting for the next season. In that waiting, small amusements became meaningful. Children, especially, found their own ways to fill the many hours of the day. They played with carved wooden toys, animals, miniature chariots, and spinning tops that wobble unevenly across packed earth floors. Their laughter filled the air of narrow alleyways between homes. Though even their games had a leisurely quality, there were no quick sprints or loud competitions. The heavy heat discouraged too much exertion, and so children learned the quiet games that fit their environment. But to truly understand the quieter side of Egyptian recreation, you must look beyond the home. Step outside and walk with the people along the river path. The Nile, at almost any hour of the day, formed the central stage of Egyptian life. It was here that you would find fishermen untangling lines while humming softly to themselves, groups of neighbors exchanging long, slow greetings, and women washing linens through methodical, repeated motions. The steady, hypnotic rhythm of life along the river gave rise to activities that matched that pace. Among the most common were the casting games, where small stones or knucklebones were tossed in simple patterns, caught mid-air, or swept across the ground in measured arcs. These games were not highly competitive. They were more like personal challenges, a way to practice dexterity and pass the hours. Many such games were played by adults as much as by children, often during the long midday heat when work paused. Another popular pastime was simply listening. Because Egypt had few trees, the world was full of unique echoes and faint sounds carried across long distances. People could spend hours listening for approaching travelers, the distant bray of donkeys, or the rhythmic chants of river workers hauling goods. The landscape itself created a kind of natural entertainment, a subtle soundtrack of everyday noise. As evening approached, the quiet games shifted. In many households, families gathered to share stories, not dramatic myths or grand tales of gods, though those existed too, but more mundane recollections. A conversation overheard at the market, a memory of a particularly good harvest, or a complaint about how the neighbor's goat had wandered into their yard again. These stories flowed slowly, often repeating familiar details because repetition comforted the listeners. Sometimes, people found amusement in music, though not in the energetic way you might expect. Much of Egyptian music was gentle and repetitive. Harps, flutes, and sistrums played slow melodies that lulled listeners into a restful calm. You might imagine a small gathering of neighbors sitting outside under the softening light of dusk, a harpist leaning back as they pluck strings in a rhythm that matches the lapping water of the Nile. The music blends with the breeze, creating a quiet moment of shared relaxation. In the Old Kingdom, some forms of recreation also involved ritual. Temples were not just places of worship, they were centers of community life, where people came to watch ceremonies, processions, and offerings. Yet even these events had a slow and methodical character. Priests moved with deliberate gestures, incense burned in carefully measured quantities, and chants were repeated over and over. For many Egyptians, observing these rituals was a kind of spiritual pastime, a calming presence that anchored their days. What makes these activities fascinating is not their excitement, but their endurance. These quiet, repetitive forms of fun lasted for centuries, largely unchanged, and through them, you can begin to see how Egyptians survived the monotony of the desert, the slow pace of agricultural cycles, and the long wait for the Nile's blessing each year. Recreation was not an escape from boredom, it was shaped by it. So as you sit with this image in your mind of a sunlit riverbank, a well-worn Senate board, and a world that moved slowly with the rise and fall of the Nile, you might begin to sense how deeply calm and measured Egyptian life truly was. It was not rushed, not overly dramatic, not filled with the constant noise that surrounds modern life. Their fun was woven into the natural pauses of the day, and as you picture yourself sliding a small wooden piece across a Senate board, feeling the soft scrape of wood on wood, you may begin to wonder, in a world that moved so slowly, guided by cycles older than memory, what deeper meaning did people find in these quiet games? And how did these simple forms of fun shape the way they saw their place in the vast, unchanging desert around them? When you imagine returning to the ancient world along the Nile, you may carry with you the image of a small Senate board and the quiet rustle of pieces moving across its surface. But to truly understand these ancient pastimes, you must now step beyond the single household. Step into the larger social landscape of ancient Egypt, where slow amusements knit communities together, shaped social hierarchies, and provided shared spaces for rest within a world otherwise defined by labor, heat, and predictable routines. The Old Kingdom, Egypt's earliest era of enduring pyramids and centralized governance, was not just a place of kings and monumental architecture. It was a world where nearly every detail of daily life relied on cooperation. Farmers worked fields in groups. Craftsmen fit stones together in silence, each trusting that the person beside them would complete their task with equal care. Even the Nile's flooding season, essential for agriculture, required coordinated effort. Because of this collective mindset, Egyptian leisure, too, became a shared experience. If you walk with villagers through a dusty settlement path, you notice that almost all recreational activities occur in small groups. Rarely does anyone play alone. Families sit together for slow games. Children gather to share toys made from leftover materials. Even adults passed time by standing in clusters along the riverbanks, exchanging slow-paced conversation. Now imagine a typical evening scene. The long day's work has ended. The sun lowers behind the western desert, turning the sky a muted orange. Fishermen gather near the boats they pulled ashore hours earlier. Their nets hang like pale ghosts in the dimming light, drying for tomorrow. They sit on overturned crates or low stools, and before them lie simple gaming pieces, pebbles worn smooth from years of handling. The fishermen cast them onto the ground, lifting them in small, practiced motions. There is no cheering, no competitive shouting. Instead, laughter emerges only in soft, short bursts. The rhythm of the game is slow, the stakes non-existent, but the companionship is what keeps them returning each night. These games were not just for leisure. They also helped reinforce social bonds. In a world where hierarchy defined nearly every aspect of life, who worked where, who lived in which part of the village, who could enter temples or handle sacred tools, games offered one of the few places where status could temporarily fade. A farmer could sit with a fisherman. A potter could challenge a neighbor who raised livestock. Even women, who carried the weight of domestic responsibilities, participated in communal pastimes, especially those that took place around shared wells or along washing areas. These sites of everyday life, wells, riverbanks, shade-covered corners, served as ancient gathering places. You might picture the well in the center of a village, its stone rim worn smooth by countless hands lifting water jars. Women arrive early, sometimes before dawn, to fill clay vessels for the day ahead. In the waiting, they talk. They speak of their families, the weather, the state of crops, and the behavior of household animals. But they also pass the time with quiet amusements. A simple guessing game, a shift of shells on the ground, or rhythmic tapping on a jar with a small stick. These gentle patterns likely formed some of the earliest forms of shared entertainment. No rules written, no loud celebration, yet still something to fill the slow space between tasks. If you wander toward the outskirts of the village, you might encounter small groups of children playing with homemade toys. Their games reveal much about the materials of daily Egyptian life. Most toys were constructed from objects at hand, shards of pottery, sticks, scraps of fabric, or balls of tightly wound reeds. The ingenuity required to make such toys highlights the frugality of a society that wasted little. Children learned early to create fun out of what they had. Many of these toys still survive in tombs, preserved unintentionally by dry sand. When you see them today, tiny carved animals with wheels, slender dolls with braided hair, balls wrapped in leather, you can almost imagine the slow afternoons they once occupied. Among adults, one of the most quietly significant aspects of recreation involved the sharing of stories. Though Egyptians left behind vast records of administrative details, grain tallies, tax receipts, lists of livestock, they recorded very little of the everyday tales they told each other. Yet remnants of personal stories appear in fragments of letters and inscriptions. These suggest a culture where people frequently retold small events that seemed unimportant at first glance. Someone might recount how the baker's donkey refused to move for half an hour in the middle of the road, or how a nearby farmer used a new irrigation tool with mixed results, or how two neighbors argued over which family's granary was more orderly. These stories were rarely dramatic. Instead, they were repeated, reshaped, and passed around quietly. They served as entertainment in the most ordinary sense, something to think about while working, something to laugh about gently, something to share with a visitor. Within wealthier households, entertainment could be slightly more formal, but it still retained the slow, deliberate quality of Egyptian leisure. A table set for a small gathering might display a Senet board or other strategy games, like Mehen, the game of the snake. In Mehen, players moved pieces along a spiral path carved into a board shaped like a coiled serpent. The pieces resembled small lions or spherical stones. Like Senet, Mehen required patience. One did not rush a move. Each action was deliberate, sometimes preceded by long periods of silent consideration. These gatherings were not lively parties. Instead, they resembled meditative sessions. Guests sat quietly, often accompanied by soft music, played on a small harp or flute. Wine or beer might be served, but in modest amounts. The aim was not celebration, but calm engagement. The atmosphere in such homes likely felt hushed and focused, the conversation measured, the games unfolding slowly under low lamplight. The musicians who played at these gatherings led quiet lives of their own. Music was a respected skill, passed down within families, and musicians often performed in both domestic and religious settings. The instruments produced soft, repetitive melodies. Harps created long, smooth tones. Flutes whispered breathy notes. Sistrums, rattles made of metal or wood, added a gentle metallic rhythm. The music did not demand attention. Instead, it created a soft atmosphere in which games or conversation could continue uninterrupted. In temple environments, recreation took on a more spiritual dimension. Priests spent long hours maintaining order within sacred spaces, preparing offerings, lighting incense, and reciting ritual chants. Their recreation was tied to the rhythm of religious life. Some priests enjoyed quiet writing sessions, practicing calligraphy on fragments of pottery. Others solved small puzzles or examined miniature carvings. These activities helped pass time between long ceremonies and allowed priests to reflect on the orderliness they believed governed the world. Even within tomb-building communities, like the famous workers' village of Deir el-Medina, though from a slightly later period, leisure took on similar quiet characteristics. Workers who spent their days carving intricate scenes into limestone walls relaxed at night with slow games, mild storytelling, and simple music. Their homes, though modest, often had painted walls featuring playful animals or geometric patterns, decorations that suggest an appreciation for quiet beauty rather than dramatic spectacle. The concept of fun in ancient Egypt was deeply tied to the idea of balance, or ma'at. Leisure was not meant to disrupt life or cause excess. It was meant to fit neatly between obligations, offering a gentle release without breaking the rhythm of daily duty. This is why Egyptian amusements rarely involved large crowds, loud noises, or intense physical activity. Instead, they revolved around small, manageable actions: a moved game piece, a tossed pebble, a repeated melody, a shared story. But despite their simplicity, these activities had deeper significance. They helped people cope with a landscape that was both nurturing and harsh. The Nile sustained life, but the surrounding desert loomed as a constant reminder of mortality and fragility. Recreation offered moments of calm, a way to process the monotony, the responsibilities, and the uncertainties of survival. You might now consider how these slow amusements shaped Egyptian identity. Over centuries, they reinforced patience, attentiveness, and a respect for deliberate action. They taught children to focus, to wait, and to appreciate subtlety. They provided adults with gentle relief from physical labor. They strengthened community bonds through quiet interaction, and they ultimately left impressions deep enough to be recorded in tombs, preserved in artifacts, remembered in artwork, and recognized even now. As you sit with these images of neighbors gathered around a simple game, of children playing with reed dolls, of priests tracing slow lines on pottery shards, you may begin to notice how different their concept of fun was from modern life. There were no distractions that demanded constant attention. Instead, entertainment arose from small moments of stillness, shaped by a world where time moved with the river's pace. Yet, as the quiet games of the evening wind down, and the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom settle into rest, a lingering question emerges. If these simple amusements were so central to daily life, what role did they play in the beliefs and rituals surrounding death? And why were some games, like Senet, placed in tombs beside the deceased? You return now to the stillness of the Nile Valley. But this time, you look beyond the daily rhythms of life and toward the enduring mystery of how ancient Egyptians wove leisure into their understanding of eternity. The quiet games they played, so simple, so patient, so seemingly ordinary, held meanings that stretched far beyond the passing of time. To conclude this journey through the quiet amusements of the Old Kingdom, you must look at how these games became more than entertainment, how they became symbols, guides, and companions for the dead. Consider once more the game of Senet, which began as a pastime but evolved into something sacred. Archaeologists have uncovered boards buried with the deceased, tucked among pottery, tools, and figurines. These boards often appear more ornate than the ones used for daily games, carved in wood or stone and painted with careful detail. Their presence in tombs raises an intriguing question. Why would a quiet game, one played in moments of rest, one shared between neighbors and family, be so essential that it accompanied a person into the afterlife? To find the answer, picture a tomb scene painted on a wall. A man sits before a Senet board, his hand extended, frozen in the act of making a move. The opponent across from him is not another living person, but often depicted as an invisible presence, a spirit, a god, or fate itself. In this art, the game becomes symbolic. It is no longer a casual pastime. It is a map of the soul's journey. Over time, Egyptians began to interpret Senet as a metaphor for passing through the obstacles of the afterlife. The squares on the board, originally game positions, became associated with specific challenges the soul might face. Some squares represented safe passage. Others indicated dangers. Some symbolized blessings or protection. The slow, deliberate movement of the game pieces mirrored the ideal journey of the deceased. Steady, thoughtful, and balanced. But even before Senet adopted these religious layers, the foundation of this association was already present in daily life. To the Egyptians, recreation wasn't escapist, it was integrated with their understanding of the world. The slow games reinforced patience, a valued trait. The careful movement of pieces emphasized foresight. The shared silence between players mirrored the quiet that accompanied ritual ceremonies. Thus, when Senet became a symbol of the afterlife, it did so naturally. It was already aligned with the rhythm of Egyptian existence, methodical, measured, and deeply connected to cosmic order. Now imagine yourself inside a tomb, deep within the desert rock. The air is cool and still. Painted on the walls are scenes of food preparation, farming, fishing, and other ordinary tasks. These images are not meant to entertain the living, but to remind the dead and the gods of the life once lived. Yet among these practical scenes, you also see the deceased sitting before a Senet board. This inclusion suggests something profound. Quiet recreation was not merely a way to pass time. It was part of what made life complete. The game represented peace, order, leisure, connection, qualities that the Egyptians hoped to carry with them beyond death. But Senet was not the only pastime linked to the afterlife. Even the simplest amusements carried metaphorical weight. Toys, found in children's tombs, tiny animals carved from wood or clay, acted as companions for the soul. Rattles and spinning tops placed beside infants suggested continuity of comfort. Even casts of knuckle bones or throwing sticks occasionally appeared in burials. These items reinforced the idea that leisure was part of the eternal ideal. The afterlife, as the Egyptians envisioned it, was not a place of constant struggle or worship. It was a place of completeness, where the joys and rhythms of life continued in perfect balance. You might consider how strange this seems from a modern perspective. Many cultures today associate the afterlife with solemnity, purity, or transcendent experiences. But the ancient Egyptians had a more grounded vision. Their ideal eternity looked much like their lives, just without hardship. There would be fields to tend, boats to sail, food to enjoy, and yes, games to play. Recreation was not an extra. It was essential. To understand why these quiet amusements held such weight, return to the social and emotional purpose they served in daily life. The slow pace of Egyptian entertainment was not just about filling time, it was a reflection of their worldview. Egyptians saw their society as part of a universal order mart, where everything had its place, its rhythm, and its proper balance. A game like Senet trained the mind to think within that order. A simple gathering around a storyteller reinforced community ties. A moment listening to soft music grounded a person in the calmness of existence. These patterns helped people navigate a world that could be brutal. The desert was unforgiving. Crops depended on forces far beyond human control. Illness could spread quickly. political upheaval could disrupt entire regions. Yet through quiet leisure, Egyptians cultivated resilience. Imagine a farmer who has worked since dawn, his back bent over rich black soil still moist from the Nile's flood. He returns home exhausted, but sits with his family to play a few slow rounds of senet. The simple act offers comfort, a small reminder that life contains predictable rhythms, even when the world feels uncertain. The game pieces move across the board, just as the seasons move across the year. The outcome is uncertain, but the process remains stable. The same stability appears in communal games. Fishermen tossing stones together, potters chatting while shaping clay, women tapping rhythmic patterns on water jars. These slow amusements reinforce the sense of continuity within the village. And continuity was the foundation of survival. This deep connection between daily slow amusements and philosophical balance explains why the Egyptians brought these activities into their tombs. To their minds, a person should carry with them every aspect of life that embodied Ma'at. Not only food and tools, but also patience, companionship, and simple pleasure. Even the placement of these items in a tomb reflected careful intention. Senet boards were often set near depictions of banquets, while miniature toys rested beside figures of servants. Everything was arranged to suggest a life that continued, gently and steadily. Yet despite this integration of leisure and eternity, one question lingers. Did the Egyptians ever see their games as truly competitive? Were there moments when the quiet pastime sparked a rare burst of excitement or frustration? The evidence suggests that while competition existed, it remained controlled. Written records occasionally mention disputes over game outcomes, but these accounts are rare. The Egyptians did not celebrate winners loudly or shame losers publicly. Instead, they emphasized the act of playing. The outcome mattered far less than the maintenance of calm and order. This attitude reached its height when Senet entered the religious sphere. By the New Kingdom, the game was depicted in funerary texts as a contest between the deceased and a supernatural opponent. Winning the game symbolized safe passage to the afterlife. Losing could signify danger or delay. But even in these depictions, the mood remained serene. The deceased is shown poised and composed, not anxious or hurried. The game was solemn, not frantic. Through this lens, you begin to see the quiet games of the Nile, not as trivial amusements, but as threads woven deeply into Egypt's cultural fabric. They taught values, strengthened communities, offered comfort, and bridged life with death. Now return once more to the riverbank, where the final light of day softens the edges of the world. A family sits under a palm frond awning, the evening breeze rustling gently. A senet board rests in the center. The players lean in, the pieces sliding softly. The game proceeds slowly, just as their ancestors played it, and just as their descendants will continue to play it for centuries to come. In the quiet of that moment, the significance becomes clear. Sometimes, the most enduring aspects of history are not the dramatic events or monumental achievements, but the subtle, repetitive actions that shaped the rhythm of ordinary lives. As you reflect on these ancient scenes, a final thought lingers. In a modern world filled with noise, speed, and constant urgency, what might we learn from the people who found meaning, connection, and even a sense of eternity in the slow, simple act of moving a small wooden piece across a board? You begin this new journey by picturing the world of ancient Egyptian scribes, those quiet, meticulous record keepers who spent their days surrounded by scrolls, ink palettes, and endless repetition. Their work shaped the foundation of Egyptian administration, yet the details of their daily routines, their subtle habits, and the small ways they passed the long hours rarely make it into history books. And it is here, in these overlooked details, that you find a gentle portrait of life, lived in rhythm with the slow pulse of the Nile. Before the pharaohs built their grand temples or raised towering obelisks, before armies marched into foreign lands or priests performed elaborate rituals, it was the scribes who made the kingdom function. They counted grain, they recorded taxes, they copied legal decrees, they tracked the flow of goods from village to palace, they wrote letters for those who could not write, they made lists of workers, lists of livestock, lists of tools, lists of offerings. Their world was one of quiet order, shaped by ink and silence. Imagine yourself stepping into a scribe's workplace in the Old or Middle Kingdom. It is not a grand hall or a richly decorated chamber, but a small room with smooth mud brick walls. The light enters at a slant, filtered through a narrow opening near the ceiling. On the floor sits a low wooden stool and a reed mat. Nearby, a basket holds scrolls rolled neatly in bundles tied with thin cords. Each scroll has a small clay tag, pressed with a sign or a name, an early filing system. Simple, but effective. On a small table lies the scribe's most prized tool, the writing palette. This rectangular slab holds 2 shallow depressions for ink, black for everyday writing, and red for important names, headings, and corrections. A few slender ink-reed pens rest on top, their tips darkened from constant use. The board feels cool to the touch, smooth from long hours of careful handling. In this quiet room, the scribe begins his day. His first task is almost always preparation. Ink must be mixed, reeds must be trimmed, papyrus sheets must be checked for imperfections and cut to appropriate length. None of these chores are hurried. The scribe moves with a methodical calm, aware that mistakes in his work might misrepresent a worker's wage, a village's crop yield, or the pharaoh's decree. Precision is the foundation of his craft. Once the tools are ready, he unrolls a scroll slowly. Papyrus has a faint rustling sound, like soft paper, but thicker. It carries a distinct scent, earthy, slightly sweet, and reminiscent of the marshes where the papyrus reed grows. Each sheet has been pressed and dried by hands like his. Every line of fiber tells a small story about the Nile's abundance, and then he begins to write. The writing is not fast. Each character, every little stroke, curve, or symbol requires steady focus. Egypt's writing system is complex, composed of hundreds of signs. Some represent sounds, some represent words, others serve as classifiers that clarify meaning. The scribe knows them all, each symbol engraved deep into memory after years of training. The work is repetitive, but repetition brings a kind of peace. The scribe dips his reed into black ink, draws a line, lifts his hand, dips again, and continues. His wrist remains steady, his breathing slows. The world narrows to the size of the scroll in front of him. Hours pass this way, not in bursts of activity, but in long, gentle waves of work that resemble the Nile's unbroken flow. Despite the quiet, a scribe's life is not lonely. Outside the writing chamber, other scribes move in and out, bringing tablets, delivering reports, or waiting to borrow tools. They speak softly, respectful of each other's concentration. Their conversations revolve around small matters. A change in the number of cattle in a nearby farm, a clerk's missing list, a correction needed on a scroll. None of it is dramatic. All of it is essential. Now imagine the moment when the scribe takes a break. He stretches his legs, stands, and walks to the courtyard outside. The sunlight is warm, and the hum of distant activity creates a soft backdrop. Laborers carry baskets of grain, farmers arrive with wagons of produce. Officials speak in measured tones, reviewing accounts. The scribe sits on a shaded bench and watches life move around him. He observes the world quietly, the way scribes often do, taking note of details without drawing attention to himself. Observation is part of his nature. He notices how carts creak differently depending on the weight they bear. He notices the patterns of footprints left in the dusty ground. He notices how the wind moves through the palm leaves near the entrance of the administrative building. These slow observations are not recreation in the modern sense, but they offer the scribe brief moments of mental rest. Sometimes, while resting, he reaches into his small pouch and pulls out a polished stone or a smooth piece of pottery. These are not toys exactly, but simple objects that many scribes kept as worry stones, tokens to roll in their fingers while they think. Some scribes etched short messages or symbols into them. A prayer to Thoth, the god of writing, a proverb, or a small drawing of a bird or a fish. These objects were private amusements, subtle companions through long hours of work. On other days, the scribe passes time by practicing signs on scraps of pottery, called ostraca. Instead of wasting papyrus, he uses these shards to sketch small drawings, write proverbs, or rehearse rare hieroglyphs. This practice is quiet and absorbing. The scribe dips his reed and writes a single sign repeatedly, enjoying the rhythmic movement of his hand. Sometimes he draws animals, cats, oxen, ducks, rendered with simple but confident lines. These pieces are rarely kept. They are tossed aside when the exercise is finished, becoming fragments of forgotten recreation scattered across the workshop floor. As midday approaches, the heat becomes intense. Work slows to a crawl. The air grows heavy, and the scribes retreat indoors. This is the time when the ancient world shifted into stillness. People rested. Shade became precious. During these hot hours, the scribe might engage in one of the quietest forms of amusement: memorization. Ancient Egyptian scribes prided themselves on their memory. They could recite long passages from wisdom texts, carefully preserved teachings that encouraged discipline and moral conduct. Some of these texts warned scribes not to grow lazy. Others praised the value of steady work. Many offered simple reflections on life. The quiet man is the one who prospers. The patient man is the one who learns. Reciting these lines served as both study and comfort. Their slow rhythm mirrored the environment: the slow breath of the desert wind, the slow passing of clouds, the slow turning of the day. In the rare moments when a scribe felt restless, he might walk to the edge of the building and look out toward the fields. The sight of the rectangular plots of land divided by irrigation channels offered a visual reminder of the order he sought to maintain in his writing. Some scribes sketched these scenes on papyrus in their free time, simple landscapes with palm trees, birds, and boats on the river. These drawings were not works of art for display. They were quiet meditations, ways for a scribe to rest his mind while keeping his hand steady. A scribe's leisure also extended into the world of small conversations. When the day's tasks slowed, scribes gathered in shaded corners to talk softly among themselves. Their topics were rarely dramatic. They discussed ink mixtures, the best type of reed for pens, the difficulty of writing on rough papyrus, or the scribes they had known in their youth. They shared small jokes, often subtle, often based on wordplay, for scribes understood language better than anyone else. Some of these jokes have survived in fragments of ancient writing. They are not humorous by modern standards, but they carry a sense of quiet amusement. A playful phrase here, a gentle tease. There it is clear that scribes found joy in language itself. As the afternoon progresses, the scribes return to their scrolls. The light softens, and shadows lengthen across the writing room. The scribe dips his reed again, the ink leaving fine marks on the papyrus. He writes without hurry, aware that accuracy matters far more than speed. Before the day ends, he completes a final task: drying the ink. Papyrus sheets cannot be rolled too soon. The scribe lays them flat, often weighting the corners with small stones to prevent curling. He sits quietly while the ink dries, using the time to straighten other scrolls or examine documents for errors. This period of waiting silent and undemanding is another form of ancient recreation. It is a pause built directly into the work. Eventually, the sun sets, and the sky begins to cool. The scribe puts away his palette, cleans his reeds, and ties the scrolls into neat bundles. His day ends not with fanfare, but with the gentle satisfaction of completed tasks. And yet, one question lingers. In a life filled with quiet repetition, where most hours were spent writing, copying, and counting, how did scribes keep their minds sharp and their spirits resilient? And what subtle forms of creativity did they hide within their seemingly monotonous work? When you stand before the massive stone face of an Egyptian tomb, it's easy to imagine that the structure exists purely for reverence, some solemn monument to eternity, carved out of rock and piety. Yet, if you look more closely at the hundreds of scenes painted along the walls, you begin to see something far more mundane, and perhaps more relatable. You see fragments of everyday enjoyment: people playing games, drinking from oversized jars of beer, musicians plucking strings, dancers frozen mid-step, and families watching entertainment unfold beneath parasols. It becomes clear that the Egyptians did not merely plan for the afterlife as a spiritual journey. They planned for it as though they were packing for a very long vacation, one in which leisure and amusement played central roles. This idea of preparing forever by preserving the fun of the present was deeply rooted in their worldview. To them, the afterlife was not an abstract notion of clouds, punishment, or celestial realms. It was a continuation of the physical world, only more perfect. Whatever delighted them in life, they assumed would delight them eternally. And so, in a strangely practical way, they prepared to carry their hobbies, games, instruments, and entertainments with them. You, as a visitor wandering through these remnants thousands of years later, may notice that many tombs contain not weapons or tools alone, but the simple things that brought people contentment. One common example is the board game Senet, which appears over and over again in tomb paintings. At first glance, Senet resembles little more than a rectangular board with squares and counters, not so different from an early version of backgammon. But for the Egyptians, the game held symbolic weight. It represented the journey of the soul through the underworld, and the desire to pass safely through the chaotic trials that awaited the deceased. It was both diversion and metaphor, a pastime that became a spiritual tool. Even the wealthy and powerful were buried with ornate Senet boards crafted from expensive woods and inlaid stones. Queen Nefertari's tomb, for instance, includes a depiction of her calmly playing Senet against an invisible opponent, perhaps the forces of fate themselves. To the Egyptians, leisure and existence were inseparable. Games were not merely games, but reflections of cosmic order. Other forms of entertainment were similarly preserved. In many tombs, you find carvings of harpists and lute players, their bodies contoured around their instruments in postures that suggest familiarity, even tenderness. There were professional musicians in ancient Egypt, many of them women, and they played at banquets, festivals, and religious ceremonies. Their music ranged from solemn hymns to lively tunes meant for dancing. The harp was especially beloved, and some harps grew to such large sizes that the musician had to sit on the ground with the instrument towering above them. These musicians were sometimes considered blessed by the gods, because they invoked harmony, beauty, and emotional release. In the tombs, these musicians are often shown performing for eternity. The Egyptians believed that the deceased, upon entering the field of reeds, their version of paradise, would continue to enjoy music, food, and the company of friends. And so, they commissioned artists to paint scenes of banquets filled with laughter, dance, and sound. Imagine a long table with trays of figs, onions, and roasted goose, while jug-bearers pour beer and wine into tall vessels. Dancers twist their bodies in slow, elegant movements, their linen garments flowing in exaggerated arcs designed to evoke motion even in stillness. The walls echo with silence now, but once at least in the imagination, they were filled with the commotion of celebration. What is striking is how ordinary these scenes are. They do not depict epic battles or mythological grandeur, even though such themes appeared elsewhere. Instead, they preserve a record of the same kinds of joys that people across cultures have always cherished. The pleasure of playing, listening, watching, and participating. The Egyptians, practical as ever, wanted to be sure that their afterlives would not be tedious. They planned for comfort and enjoyment as meticulously as they planned for spiritual security. Among the items found in tombs are objects that appear surprisingly modern. For instance, archaeologists discovered cosmetic kits, including mirrors, coal tubes, perfumed oils, and intricately carved combs. These were not luxuries reserved for royalty alone. They were everyday items used to prepare for social gatherings. Looking presentable was considered important, not only in life, but also in eternity. After all, why wouldn't one want to look their best for an eternal banquet? There were also toys for children placed inside graves. Small carved animals on wheels, miniature dolls with movable limbs, and even early versions of balls made from bundled plant fibers. These objects remind you that leisure was not an adult privilege, it was part of the universal human experience. Children in ancient Egypt, much like today, played to learn, to socialize, and simply to pass the time with joy. The inclusion of toys in burials suggests that the Egyptians believed children, too, needed company and comfort in the afterlife. Their worldview was gentle in this way, acknowledging that even in death, one should not be without the small pleasures that shape childhood. Then there were the more unusual forms of amusement, such as gymnastics and acrobatics. Some tomb murals show performers bending backward in extreme arches, or balancing on their hands with legs straightened overhead. They appear in scenes related to festivals and ceremonies, their bodies forming elegant shapes reminiscent of modern-day contortionists. These acrobats were not simply performers, they were part of a larger cultural tradition of awe, skill, and coordinated movement. For the Egyptians, physical displays were both entertainment and a demonstration of harmony between body and spirit. To include them in tomb art was to ensure that the deceased would continue to witness displays of agility and grace, an eternal reminder of beauty expressed through bodily strength. Of course, the Egyptians also appreciated humor, though their jokes were often subtle or embedded within everyday scenes. Some drawings depict animals acting like humans, donkeys playing harps, or cats herding geese, which suggests a playful imagination. These images, though rare in formal contexts, demonstrate that the Egyptians enjoyed visual satire. Humor, to them, was something that belonged naturally to life, and what belonged to life was worth taking beyond it. This tendency to bring the ordinary into the extraordinary is partly why Egyptian tombs feel so alive. They are records not merely of grandeur, but of routine, even scenes that appear solemn at first glance, such as the opening of the mouth ceremony, which reanimated the senses of the deceased so they could eat, drink, and speak in the afterlife, were deeply associated with preservation of everyday comforts. Eating and drinking were pleasures, and thus worth safeguarding eternally. Tombs frequently show the deceased receiving offerings of bread, onions, beer, and cuts of meat, all sealed in jars and trays. These were not symbolic items alone. Egyptians placed real food inside tombs as well, believing the spiritual essence of the food would be consumed by the deceased. In this way, their understanding of leisure blended seamlessly with their understanding of ritual. Activities that we might separate into categories, spiritual, recreational, nutritional, were interconnected in ancient Egypt. To rest with friends, to listen to music, to play a game, to enjoy a refreshing drink, these were not trivial indulgences. They were parts of a well-lived life, and therefore essential to a well-lived afterlife. Even the architecture of their tombs reflected this philosophy. Some tombs included small chambers meant to resemble domestic spaces, a miniature home for eternity. Others included gardens carved onto walls, complete with ponds, lotus blossoms, and pergolas. These were designed to evoke tranquility and delight. The Field of Reeds, their envisioned paradise, was essentially a perfected version of Egypt itself. Fertile fields, gentle breezes, calm waters, and abundant harvests. Leisure, in this imagined world, was not separate from labor. It was an extension of satisfaction, of living in harmony with the land. As you move deeper into this world of preserved joy, you may notice that the Egyptians viewed time differently than modern societies do. They were not concerned with progress in the sense of constantly changing or innovating. Instead, they valued continuity, the idea that what was good and beautiful should remain unchanged. Their leisure activities, though simple by today's standards, remained consistent for thousands of years. A person in the Old Kingdom might play the same game as someone in the New Kingdom. Their music, though evolving slowly, maintained recognizable forms. Their festivals followed annual cycles tied to the Nile's rhythms. To them, predictability was not dull. It was comforting, stabilizing, and eternal. This helps explain why their afterlife was not imagined as a radical transformation, but rather as a perfected mirror of life. If life was good, with its mixture of work and rest, then a flawless version of life endless abundance, endless enjoyment was ideal. And so they prepared for it in remarkably practical ways. They built tombs large enough to house not just their bodies but their hobbies. They commissioned artisans to paint moments of leisure with meticulous care. They crafted objects that could survive thousands of years underground. They ensured that their fun, simple, repetitive, ordinary, would outlast even the memory of their names. In this final section, you've seen leisure in its eternal form. Yet one question lingers, subtle but persistent. Why did the Egyptians, more than nearly any ancient civilization, feel compelled to preserve their joy so carefully? Was it their belief in the continuity of life after death? Was it their confidence in the stability of their world? Or was it something more universal, something that speaks to a human desire to hold on to the comforting mundanities that make life feel full? And as you stand before these ancient murals, you might begin to wonder whether the Egyptians truly believed they could carry their pleasures with them forever, or whether they simply hoped that by recording them, someone someday might remember the quiet, ordinary joys that once filled their world. You might imagine ancient Egypt as a land of pharaohs, pyramids, and priests. People whose names echo loudly through history. But if you look beneath the glamour and the monumental stone, you will find a quieter force, one that shaped Egypt far more consistently than any king or conqueror. This force was made up of men, and occasionally women, who spent their days sitting cross-legged in shaded courtyards, hunched over scraps of papyrus, reed pens stained with ink, meticulously recording every mundane detail of life along the Nile. These were the scribes, the bureaucratic heartbeat of a civilization that prized order above almost everything else. It is easy to overlook them because their work seems dull at first glance. They wrote lists, endless lists of grain deliveries, tax payments, animal inventories, and labor assignments. They copied religious texts, legal decrees, and medical prescriptions. They documented building projects, harvest cycles, temple offerings, and even which households failed to repair their section of the local canal. In the grand scheme of history, this kind of work risks blending into the background noise. But the Egyptians understood something vital. Without scribes, their world would slip into disorder. So they elevated these meticulous record keepers to a status just below the elite and carved out a unique place for them in society. Imagine waking up as a young scribe in training. Your day would begin before the sun had fully risen, perhaps with the gentle rustle of palm fronds outside your home as a breeze passed over the river. You would sit on a mat beside your teacher, practicing the delicate strokes of hieratic script, the faster, more fluid form of writing used for everyday administration. The characters were small and curved, requiring precision and steady hands. You would practice each sign over and over again. The symbol for water, the determinative that indicated a profession, the tiny strokes that marked quantities of grain. There was no shortcut to mastery. Scribes trained for years before they were trusted with official documents. In most of Egypt, literacy was rare, limited to a small percentage of the population. Those who could read and write formed a kind of intellectual class. They were not wealthy by default, but their skills granted them social mobility and job security. A scribe learned not only writing, but also arithmetic, law, and the structure of government. They understood how taxes were collected, where food was stored, who worked on state projects, and which temples needed new offerings. In a country as complex and centralized as Egypt, this knowledge made them indispensable. But despite the importance of their role, the daily life of a scribe was rarely glamorous. If you were a scribe assigned to a village granary, you might spend your day counting sacks of barley delivered after harvest, noting the quality of the grain, marking down quantities to be stored for the state, and interviewing farmers about their expected yields. You might stand for long hours in the sun, watching workers weigh goods on wooden scales, while you kept careful records on a fresh sheet of papyrus. You had to be accurate, because the entire tax system depended on your notes. A single mistake could lead to shortages, disputes, or reprimands from the official overseeing your division. If you worked in the service of a temple, your responsibilities would look slightly different. You would document offerings brought by the faithful: bread, perfumed oil, linen cloth, cattle, figs, and ensure they were properly distributed among the priests and the temple storerooms. You might also copy ritual texts, detailing prayers or festival schedules. Temples were centers of economic life, owning land, workers, and property. Their administrators relied heavily on scribes to keep everything functioning smoothly. Some scribes served the government directly, especially during major building projects. When the pharaoh commissioned a new tomb or temple, teams of workers were mobilized: masons, stonecutters, plasterers, painters, water carriers, cooks. A scribe was assigned to count them, mark down their attendance, note absences, and track the distribution of wages, usually paid in bread, beer, and grain. In the famous village of Deir el-Medina, where the tomb builders of the Valley of the Kings lived, scribes kept detailed records of everything, from worker assignments to food rations. These documents, preserved on ostraca broken pottery shards, often used as writing surfaces, give you a remarkably intimate look at everyday administration. Some lists are so ordinary that they feel strangely modern. Absent: one worker ill, one caring for his mother, one brewing beer. Yet the life of a scribe was not entirely consumed by administrative drudgery. The position granted access to learning, and learning brought prestige. Scribes were known for their sharp thinking, and many took pride in their ability to solve logistical problems or interpret obscure rules. A good scribe could anticipate shortages before they happened, prevent conflicts by keeping clear records, and guide local officials through the complexities of state policy. Their value lay not only in writing, but in understanding the inner workings of a society that depended heavily on organization. Because their work was so crucial, scribes often enjoyed privileges denied to manual laborers. While most Egyptians performed physically demanding tasks, farming, building, carrying, weaving, scribes worked primarily with their minds. They wrote in shaded courtyards, inside offices attached to temples or storehouses, or beneath canopies erected near fields. Their tools were simple but significant: a wooden palette with 2 small inkwells, one for black, one for red, a bundle of sharpened reeds, a roll of papyrus, and a pot of water for mixing ink. These objects became symbols of status. To carry a scribe's palette was to announce one's education to the world. Still, the job had its frustrations. Ink stained your fingers. Papyrus tore easily. Your back would ache from sitting cross-legged for hours. The ink dried out under the sun or spilled unexpectedly across your work. Officials demanded quick results. Farmers argued about measurements or tried to underreport their harvests. Temple priests insisted on perfection when copying sacred texts. Government overseers checked your work for errors and expected loyalty to the state. Yet, even with these pressures, scribes enjoyed a unique comfort. They were needed. Egypt's vast bureaucracy, one of the earliest and most sophisticated in human history, relied on their diligence. Without the scribes, tribute would not flow. Granaries would falter, labor projects would halt, and temples would struggle to maintain their daily functions. In many ways, the scribes were the invisible architects of Egypt's stability. The education of scribes reflects this importance. Instead of apprenticeship alone, scribes trained in formal schools, often attached to temples or administrative centers. These schools were strict, emphasizing memorization, repetition, and discipline. Lessons included copying wisdom texts, moral teachings, and practical instructional writings. One famous text, often assigned to students, advised, "A scribe's life is better than that of a laborer. The scribe commands, while others sweat." While this was partly rhetoric designed to motivate young boys, it reveals the pride associated with the profession. A skilled scribe could rise through the ranks. Some became chief scribes, overseeing teams of writers. Others became advisors to officials or record keepers for the royal court. A few even transitioned into the priesthood, where literacy was essential for performing complex rituals. In rare cases, scribes achieved high political office, though this required not only skill, but also connections and trust from superiors. Despite their elevated status, scribes remained closely connected to the everyday world of common Egyptians. They visited markets, fields, workshops, and granaries. They interacted with farmers, craftsmen, priests, and workers. They saw famine and abundance, disputes and resolutions, joy and grief. Their records, some of which survive today, offer one of the most intimate windows into daily life in ancient Egypt. For example, through scribe records we know how wages were distributed, how work crews were structured, and how villages responded to shortages. We know what people purchased at market stalls, which items were considered valuable, and how often families brewed beer. We know what punishments were given for minor crimes, how land was measured, and even which years experienced unusually high flooding. Scribes documented everything because the Egyptians believed deeply in the power of order. To write something down was to preserve it, to prevent confusion, to impose structure on a world that could easily slip into chaos. If you think about it, this belief in writing as a stabilizing force explains why scribes were so respected. They were not simply record keepers, they were guardians of order. Their daily routines, however tedious, were acts of preservation, helping maintain a system that lasted thousands of years. Yet, for all this clarity, one question lingers quietly beneath the surface of their work. What did the scribes themselves think about their routines? When they recorded endless lists of grain deliveries, did they find satisfaction in the structure, or did they secretly long for a life beyond ink and papyrus? If you were to follow a scribe through the landscape of ancient Egypt, not as a distant observer, but as someone walking beside him, you would notice that his world was shaped by rhythms as predictable as the Nile itself. The river rose and fell. The crops grew and were harvested. The tax cycle reset. And through all of it, the scribe recorded, measured, counted, and confirmed. These tasks could be monotonous, even numbing, yet they offered a sense of stability that few other professions enjoyed. It is here, in the quiet corners of Egypt's bureaucratic machinery, that the scribe's life becomes most revealing, because behind the endless lists and tallies lies a deeper truth. Scribes were not simply note-takers, they were interpreters of a system that depended on balance between government and people, between land and water, between order and chaos. Their seemingly bland tasks helped maintain that balance in thousands of small but essential ways. To understand this more fully, imagine you are standing beside a scribe during the annual Nile inundation. The river floods its banks, darkening the fields with nutrient-rich silt. Most villagers watch the rise of the water with hope or apprehension, waiting to see whether it will bring abundance or destruction. But the scribe watches it differently. He stands near the edge of the river, at the Nilometer, a stone staircase, or measuring well, recording the height of the flood. His notes will determine tax rates for the year. A generous flood means higher taxes, because harvests will be plentiful. A low flood means lighter taxes, because yields will be poor. His numbers will ripple through every household. This measurement wasn't a simple task. It required him to compare the present flood to flood records from previous years, to consider local soil conditions, and to account for the needs of the state. If he miscalculated, families might suffer. Yet, if he underestimated too often, the government might reprimand him or send additional overseers to audit his work. A balance had to be struck, one that reflected both reality and political expectations. It was a subtle, routine negotiation, repeated generation after generation. After the flood receded and the planting began, the scribe's duties shifted. He traveled through fields, sometimes with assistants, observing the growth of barley, emmer, wheat, flax, and vegetables. He visited farmers to record their expected yields and checked whether they were cultivating the correct portions of land. Tax obligations depended not only on output, but on land use, and so the scribe became an unofficial inspector. He carried a measuring rope, and with it, he determined the boundaries of plots. Land disputes were common, especially after floods, blurred property lines, and the scribe's word often settled arguments that could otherwise escalate. Walking through the fields, he was both welcomed and resented. Farmers relied on him to ensure fairness, Yet they feared the accuracy of his notes. A single stroke of his reed pen could mean the difference between surplus and shortage. Still, he was rarely treated with hostility. Writing conferred a kind of authority that Egyptians respected, even if they did not always like the outcomes it produced. Inside the granaries, the thick-walled, dome-topped structures where grain was stored, you would find the scribe seated behind a low table, papyrus scrolls unfurled before him. Workers carried heavy sacks across the threshold, pouring grain into bins, while overseers checked for quality. The scribe noted each load in calm, careful strokes. His work here was repetitive, but it required vigilance. Fraud was common. Workers might hide grain in baskets or under clothing. Farmers might mix sands into harvests to increase weight. In some villages, scribes documented such attempts with dry humor. Brought barley, full of stones, weighed less when clean. This attention to detail made scribes indispensable, but also isolated. They were trained to remain impartial, loyal to records rather than individuals. Even friendships were tempered by caution. A farmer who shared beer with a scribe one night might find himself taxed more heavily the next day because his field had yielded more grain than previously estimated. The scribe's job demanded consistency above all else, and yet the monotony of administration was punctuated by rare moments of intellectual or ceremonial excitement. Consider the times when scribes were summoned to temples during festivals. Temples needed records of offerings made during celebrations, oil for lighting the shrine, incense burned in honor of the gods, bread and beer provided to priests. During festivals like the Opet or the beautiful festival of the valley, crowds gathered, music echoed through the streets, and dancers performed. The scribe walked among all of this clamor with his palette and papyrus, recording practical matters. Quantities of food prepared, vessels used, gates opened, processions completed. In the midst of spiritual devotion, he remained grounded in lists and numbers. But perhaps the most intriguing part of a scribe's life emerges when you look at what they wrote outside their official duties. Many scribes copied literary texts, either for practice or personal interest. These texts ranged from instructional wisdom, advice on how to live an orderly life, to satirical works, mocking professions like farmers, soldiers, or potters. In one text, a scribe exaggerates the misery of manual laborers to highlight the superiority of the scribe's life. The farmer wakes before dawn and plows in mud. He breaks his back. But you, scribe, sit in shade with a heart at ease. Such writings reveal a subtle pride in their profession. Scribes saw themselves not merely as administrators, but as thinkers. They viewed writing as a path to refinement, a way to rise above the physical demands of life. Their pride, however, was rarely boastful. It was more like a quiet confidence rooted not in wealth or power, but in usefulness. You might imagine a scribe sitting in the corner of his home in the evening. After a long day of work, a small clay lamp flickers beside him. The air smells faintly of oil and dust. He unrolls a papyrus scroll. Not an official record this time, but a text he is copying for pleasure or practice. His wife prepares food nearby. His children play outside. There is a calmness in the scene, a sense that writing is not merely his occupation but his anchor in the world. Even so, scribes were not immune to stress or disagreement. One of the most fascinating examples comes from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders. Writings preserved there include personal letters between scribes, full of complaints and bureaucratic frustrations. One scribe chastises another for failing to return borrowed papyrus. Another complains that his colleague miscounted a work crew. Still another records that he cannot complete his duties because he is unwell. My hand trembles, and I cannot hold the reed. These small, unremarkable notes remind you that behind the efficiency of Egypt's bureaucracy were real people, tired, overworked, sometimes irritated, sometimes proud. Their emotions rarely show up in official documents, but they leak into personal writings in charmingly ordinary ways. Outside of work, scribes often participated in local courts. Because they could read and write, they recorded testimonies, verdicts, and disputes. Egyptian law emphasized restoring balance rather than imposing harsh punishment, and scribes played a central role in this process. They documented agreements between families, marriages, property transfers, and loans. Their accuracy ensured fairness. If an issue arose years later, their notes settled the matter. Scribes were also essential during times of scarcity. When Nile floods failed and famine threatened the land, it was the scribes who assessed shortages, coordinated distributions, and traced where supplies had gone. They became mediators between the government and the people, tasked with preventing panic or rebellion. In these moments, the calm, methodical routines of scribes took on a new weight. Their lists became lifelines, and yet, even in crisis, they remained grounded in process. They recorded not emotions, but outcomes, not fear, but quantity, not panic, but procedure. Their writing style was dry, precise, unwavering. There is an odd comfort in this, an assurance that even during uncertainty, someone was keeping track of the small things. Still, there was a tension beneath their routine. The entire system, the grain quotas, the land measurements, the temple records, depended on political stability. A change in leadership could alter everything. A powerful official might demand inflated numbers to impress the pharaoh. A corrupt overseer might pressure a scribe into recording false information. The scribe had to navigate these pressures carefully. Too much resistance could be dangerous. Too much compliance could compromise the system he was trained to uphold. You can imagine the quiet anxiety that accompanied such decisions. Does he follow the numbers he sees in the field, or the numbers he is told to write? Does he protect the farmers, or does he protect himself? The tension between truth and authority was a subtle but constant concern in the scribe's world, which leads to a deeper reflection. If the scribes were the keepers of order, what happened when order itself was strained? Egypt did experience periods of instability, famine, regional conflict, political division, and in these times, the work of scribes became even more challenging. Their records from these periods reveal disruptions, incomplete tallies, unexpected shortages, frustrated notes. Yet, even during chaos, they kept writing. They continued to measure, to track, to count. It was as if the act of writing itself helped maintain the illusion of stability. And so, as you follow the scribe through his long day, from fields to granaries, from temples to courts, from family life to private study, you begin to see the quiet persistence that kept Egypt functioning. These bureaucrats rarely appear in dramatic historical narratives. They left behind no heroic tales, but they left behind something more enduring. The steady, uneventful documentation of a civilization that thrived because it valued order. By the time you enter the final stretch of a scribe's story, you begin to notice something subtle but striking. The life of a scribe was one of constant balance, caught between the permanence of written records and the impermanence of the world. Those records were meant to stabilize. Ink on papyrus endures only if it is protected. Scrolls only survive if they are stored carefully, and records only maintain their authority if those who rely on them respect the rules of the system. In a civilization that prized order above all, scribes were the living embodiment of structure. But even they were not immune to the slow, creeping chaos of life along the Nile. Consider, first, the mechanics of record preservation. Papyrus, though sturdy in dry conditions, is fragile. It can crack, tear, or fade. Ink can smudge. Storage rooms can flood or collapse. Officials who were careless or corrupt might misplace a scroll or deliberately alter its content. Even a scribe's meticulousness could not guarantee permanence. And yet, for centuries, scribes trained in precise copying and careful cataloging developed methods to mitigate these risks. Scrolls were numbered, duplicate copies were made, records were stored in sealed containers or placed inside temple archives. Red ink highlighted corrections or emphasized important sections, ensuring clarity. In a way, every stroke of a reed pen was a small act of preservation, an effort to outwit the inexorability of time. Yet despite all these precautions, scribes occasionally faced circumstances that tested their skills and resilience. Egypt was not immune to famine, invasion, or political instability. During periods when central authority weakened, such as the First Intermediate Period, roughly 2181, 2055 BCE, records became unreliable, scattered, or incomplete. Local officials might hoard grain, inflate reports to appear more competent, or ignore scribe instructions entirely. In such moments, scribes confronted the limits of their power. They were trained to uphold order, but order itself was vulnerable. The same hand that recorded abundance had to document scarcity, frustration, and failure. Imagine a scribe sitting in a small, dimly lit office during a particularly bad year of flooding. The fields are partially submerged, crops failing, the tax quotas impossible to meet. He dips his reed pen into black ink and begins to record. Field 12. Barley destroyed. Yield insufficient. Field 15. Wheat partially lost. Total expected grain. 2,000 measures. Each line is factual, calm, measured, but beneath it is the unspoken anxiety of a man documenting a world in crisis. The words themselves do not change the outcome. They are a quiet witness, a record of inevitability. Even in these moments, scribes found subtle ways to maintain order and confidence. They would cross-check measurements, verify reports, and sometimes add small notes, suggesting remedies or adjustments. In one fragment from Deir el-Medina, a scribe notes that some laborers were sent home due to illness and recommends rationing remaining supplies. His handwriting is neat, his lines precise. The words are devoid of panic, yet they carry the weight of responsibility for entire communities. It is here that the scribe's quiet resilience becomes apparent. They understood that chaos could not always be prevented, but careful attention and methodical documentation could mitigate its effects. Their work was a form of slow, sustained intervention, an almost meditative insistence that, even when events spiral beyond human control, clarity and record-keeping matter. The scribe's daily routine, mundane as it may seem, was both a buffer against disorder and a reflection of deeper human values. His patient copying of texts, measured recording of grain, careful tallying of workers, all these actions maintained the rhythm of society. In essence, the scribes served as the nervous system of ancient Egypt, imperceptible when functioning smoothly, yet essential for the life of the body as a whole. Without their constant vigilance, the monumental achievements of Egypt, its pyramids, temples, and irrigation systems, could not function effectively over long periods. Yet for all their diligence, the scribe's life was intertwined with mortality. Unlike the pharaoh, whose life and legacy were celebrated with grandeur, or the wealthy who commissioned lavish tombs, scribes often depended on their families and local communities to maintain their memory. Many scribes were buried with small personal touches. A carefully carved palette, a few ink-stained reeds, and perhaps a miniature papyrus scroll containing wisdom sayings or poems. These were not ostentatious markers of power, but intimate artifacts that reflected both their profession and their values. In a sense, the scribe's legacy was encoded not in monuments, but in continuity, in the lives of those who benefited from their meticulous records long after they had passed. Some scribes managed to leave a more enduring mark. Certain chief scribes, administrators attached to temples or royal courts, were credited with authoring legal codices, overseeing major construction projects, or compiling religious texts. Their names appear in inscriptions, and their work sometimes survives in fragmentary form. But even these notable scribes did not live lives of spectacle. Their influence was measured in small increments. A correctly calculated grain delivery, a list of workers properly maintained, a legal decision accurately transcribed. In all cases, their impact lay in steadiness rather than drama. Interestingly, the life of the scribe was not without moments of subtle creativity. Copying texts was both instruction and art. Hieratic writing demanded a steady hand and an eye for proportion. Some scribes embellished letters with miniature flourishes. Others experimented with layouts, adding marginal illustrations or mnemonic devices. Even within the constraints of bureaucracy, scribes discovered space for quiet expression. The act of writing became a form of personal engagement, a balance between duty and identity. Occasionally, scribes engaged with humor or satire. Some ostraka, scraps of pottery or limestone, contain playful sketches of animals, exaggerated human figures, or whimsical dialogues. These writings were never formalized. They were private amusements, little windows into the human side of a profession, dominated by lists and numbers. Through these sketches, you glimpse their minds at rest, finding subtle relief from repetitive work. Despite these small creative outlets, the overarching theme of a scribe's life remained stability. They were trained to act with impartiality, to maintain accurate records, even under pressure, to keep the machinery of civilization running smoothly. Their role may appear mundane from the outside, yet it required remarkable discipline, patience, and foresight. The world depended on their precision in ways that the Egyptians themselves clearly understood. And this brings us to the final reflection. The scribe's work, though unglamorous, was essential to the survival of a civilization. By quietly recording events, verifying information, and maintaining consistency, they preserved the very framework that allowed pharaohs to rule, farmers to farm, and society to function for centuries. In many ways, their legacy is less visible than stone monuments, but no less profound. Every line of ink, every carefully counted tally, every copied word was a contribution to the endurance of order. Yet, as with all human endeavors, even the scribe's meticulous work could not guarantee permanence. Time, neglect, natural decay, and human error all conspire to erase the very systems they labored to protect. Most of the surviving records we have today are fragmentary. Names are lost. Numbers are incomplete. Entire archives have vanished into the sands of history. The scribe's world, so carefully organized, was ultimately subject to entropy, a gentle reminder that no matter how diligent, order is never absolute. So, as you consider the scribe's life, the endless hours with reed and ink, the careful observations of crops and floods, the quiet joys of copying texts or sketching marginal doodles, you are left with a question that lingers. If stability and order were the scribe's ultimate goal, what happens when the systems they support falter? Can their meticulous records guide the living through chaos, or are they destined to be quiet witnesses to the inevitable impermanence of human enterprise? And perhaps more subtly, what can a modern observer, living in a world that moves faster and more chaotically than ancient Egypt, learn from these men who devoted their lives to slow, steady attention, to precision, and to the patient maintenance of civilization? In the end, the scribes of Egypt offer a lesson not in spectacle or grandeur, but in quiet endurance. They teach us that civilization relies not only on kings and armies, temples and monuments, but on the calm, measured persistence of those who record, track, and preserve. They are reminders that even the most unassuming professions, if pursued with care, consistency, and attention, can shape history in ways that are subtle, invisible, and lasting. When you imagine the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, it is tempting to picture a vast labor force of anonymous slaves, marching in unison, hauling massive limestone blocks across the desert under the relentless sun. This image, however, obscures the human reality of those who lived and worked at the pyramid's base. They were not slaves in the classical sense. They were a structured workforce of farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who took shifts, hauling stones, carving blocks, and assembling structures designed to last millennia. And within this regimented labor, they carved out moments of play, rest, and subtle enjoyment. Human behaviors that reveal much about endurance, survival, and the quiet ingenuity of ordinary lives. Imagine arriving at a worksite in the mid-3rd millennium BCE. The air is heavy with dust, the occasional scent of limestone mingling with the river's distant aroma. The camp consists of rows of mud brick housing, kitchens with clay ovens, communal work areas, and storage spaces for tools and food. Work begins early, just after dawn, with labourers rising from mats or reed beds to the sounds of clattering pots, shouted instructions, and the soft murmur of riverside activity. Some men carry wooden sledges, others pull ropes, while teams of stonecutters chip limestone into blocks that will later be precisely measured and moved. Despite the intensity of labour, the rhythm of the work is punctuated by small human pauses, moments when the harshness of the desert fades, and the worker becomes a person rather than just a cog in a massive construction project. One of the most overlooked aspects of pyramid labour is the social dimension. Labourers were organised into crews called files, often comprising 20 men or more. These groups worked together consistently, building camaraderie through shared effort. Within these crews, competition and cooperation intertwined. There are records suggesting that workers would occasionally challenge each other in lifting heavier blocks or achieving more precise cuts in stone. Though these contests were minor and often informal, they provided a form of amusement, a chance to measure skill and stamina against peers. In a life dominated by repetition, these small games were psychologically significant. They fostered morale, community, and a sense of personal achievement. Beyond competitive games, workers created quieter, more meditative pastimes. Archaeologists have discovered inscriptions and carvings in worksite areas, simple doodles, sketches of animals, human figures, and hieroglyphs that were not part of official records. These markings reveal that labourers found moments to express themselves artistically, even in the harshest conditions. One limestone fragment shows a sketch of a donkey pulling a sledge, complete with exaggerated motion lines to indicate effort. Another depicts a small figure seated beside a pyramid, perhaps an idealized vision of rest or contemplation. These markings are subtle, almost private, but they are vital clues to the inner lives of the men building monumental structures. Food and communal meals were another source of informal relaxation. Labourers were provided with staples like bread, beer, and onions, sometimes supplemented by fish, salted meat, or fruit from the Nile Valley. These meals were more than sustenance, they were social events. Workers sat together in shade, sharing laughter, commenting on tasks, and discussing news from villages along the Nile. Beer, a low-alcohol beverage, played an essential role in fostering camaraderie. Its consumption was regulated but routine, and it was both a reward for labour and a source of modest pleasure in an otherwise grueling day. You can imagine men leaning back against stones, rolling barley dough in their hands, sipping beer, and exchanging jokes about who mismeasured a block or who fell during hauling. Even the hardest labour was softened by these communal rituals. Health and hygiene, surprisingly, contributed to moments of leisure and comfort. Pyramid workers had access to basic medical care, such as massages, herbal remedies, and treatment for minor injuries. Doctors sometimes attached to the royal administration checked for sprains, fractures, or infections. Footwear, though rudimentary, protected labourers from the desert terrain. These provisions were practical, but they also allowed men to maintain enough strength and comfort to notice small joys, a gentle breeze, a shady spot to rest, or the simple pleasure of cleanliness after long hours in dust. Rest periods were another deliberate part of the work cycle. Egypt's labour system relied on rotation. Teams worked on tasks for several days before rotating out to lighter duties or returning home. During rest periods, workers often engaged in informal recreation. They played ball games with simple leather or plant fibre balls, tossed stones in skill-based contests, or practiced wrestling moves learned in their villages. These moments were carefully scheduled by foremen to ensure that labour productivity remained high. But they also reinforced social bonds and allowed men to recharge mentally. The ancient worksite, in this sense, functioned both as a centre of monumental achievement and as a community space where recreation and survival intertwined. Some labourers carried personal rituals from home, which provided psychological relief. Amulets, small figurines, and charms placed in pockets or tied to clothing offered a sense of security. These objects were subtle but significant, reminding workers of loved ones, gods, or hopes for a safe return. They sometimes made small sketches of these symbols on nearby stones during quiet moments, blending personal devotion with artistic expression. In this way, the harshness of work was softened by spiritual and creative engagement. Interestingly, these moments of leisure were often framed by practical considerations. Fun was rarely separated entirely from work. A game could improve coordination, sketches could sharpen focus, social interaction could enhance team performance. In other words, recreation was embedded within the structure of labor itself. It was both restorative and functional. A recognition that human efficiency and endurance are intertwined with morale and well-being. Night brought another layer of quiet amusement. As the sun set over the desert and the pyramid rose against the evening sky, laborers returned to communal housing. Fires were lit for cooking, and the air filled with smoke, aroma, and low conversation. Some men sang songs passed down from their villages, recounting harvests, floods, or local legends. Others listened to stories told by elders, tales of gods, kings, or clever workers who had outwitted difficult tasks. Storytelling was a form of entertainment, education, and moral reflection, allowing workers to rest both body and mind. Listening required nothing but attention, yet it reinforced cultural memory and strengthened the sense of belonging among the crew. Sleep itself became a ritual. Beds were simple mats or reed pallets, often shared in communal rooms. Laborers slept in patterns aligned with the seasonal work schedule and the harsh midday heat. Yet, even in sleep, the rhythm of life at the pyramid reflected order, preparation, and shared endurance. Dreams and discussions about work were intertwined with imagination, and in the quiet of the night, workers could envision their accomplishments, the towering pyramid, and perhaps even the fleeting moments of joy they had carved from the day. The contrast between the monumental scale of construction and the intimate details of human leisure is striking. On one hand, massive blocks of limestone are hauled across deserts, aligned with astronomical precision, and assembled into structures that will last thousands of years. On the other hand, men take breaks to toss a ball, sketch an animal, or share a drink with friends. Monumentality and mundanity coexist, and it is in the juxtaposition that the full texture of life emerges. You begin to realize that the pyramid is not just a symbol of pharaonic power. It is a monument to the ordinary lives of countless individuals, whose small acts of endurance, creativity, and rest made the impossible possible. And yet, the story is incomplete. Even with careful scheduling, food, and structured leisure, life at the pyramid was physically taxing and psychologically intense. Injuries, fatigue, and social tensions were constants. Harsh weather and seasonal scarcity could disrupt routines. How did workers maintain morale over months or years? How did they balance the necessity of survival with the human desire for recreation? And perhaps most intriguing, what subtle forms of creativity and amusement have been lost to time, erased because they were considered trivial or unimportant by later generations? These questions remain largely unresolved, and they are what make the study of pyramid workers so compelling. Their labor shaped one of the most iconic monuments in human history. Yet the details of their daily lives, how they amused themselves, found rest, and preserved mental and physical resilience, offer a quieter, more human lesson. Life at the base of the Great Pyramid was structured, demanding, and often monotonous. Yet within that monotony, workers discovered opportunities for play, imagination, and small victories, reminding us that even in the harshest conditions, ordinary humans seek balance, joy, and survival. In the next section, we will explore how these small moments of leisure and ingenuity influence the social organization, skill development, and survival strategies of pyramid workers, and how their subtle creativity left traces that historians can still read thousands of years later. As you linger at the base of the Great Pyramid, it becomes clear that life there was a complex balance of labor, social order, skill, cultivation, and subtle entertainment. The small moments of leisure we glimpsed in Section 1 were not accidental. They were woven into the very fabric of the worksite, enhancing endurance, productivity, and survival. The pyramid was a monumental task, but it was achieved by human beings, Ordinary men who needed systems, rituals, and diversions to function day after day. One critical aspect of this balance was skill specialization. While the image of the pyramid often conjures endless lines of laborers dragging blocks, in reality, the workforce was highly stratified. Stonecutters, masons, haulers, metalworkers, carpenters, and painters all had distinct roles. Workers were rotated through positions, both to rest overused muscles and to spread expertise. This rotation offered subtle psychological relief. No one performed the same strenuous motion for years at a time. It also encouraged social learning, as experienced workers passed techniques to novices. Even within repetitive labor, there was opportunity for quiet mastery, innovation, and personal pride. The importance of skill development extended to craftsmanship and artistry. Blocks for the pyramid were precisely cut, smoothed, and aligned, requiring steady hands and acute attention to detail. Carvers would sometimes leave small, almost invisible symbols or signatures on stones, tiny marks of personal expression embedded within monumental work. Though these marks were not intended for grand display, they survive as faint traces of individual identity in an otherwise uniform labor force. In a sense, these subtle imprints were forms of leisure, an outlet for creativity that transcended the monotony of hauling and placing stone. Another dimension of survival was ritual and spiritual practice. Laborers carried amulets, small figurines, and inscriptions as protective charms, not unlike the scribes who kept talismans for continuity in their work. The pyramid itself was a sacred undertaking, and workers often engaged in rituals to ensure safety and success. Offerings of bread, beer, or small tokens were made at temporary shrines, and prayers or chants were used to bless the tools, sledges, and stones. These rituals provided psychological comfort and a sense of control in a labor-intensive and often unpredictable environment. Through repetition and ceremony, men created a rhythm to the workday that transformed physical toil into structured, almost meditative activity. Food distribution also reflected an intricate understanding of human needs. Workers were provided caloric-dense rations designed to sustain energy for physically demanding tasks. Bread, beer, and onions formed the staple, but meat, fish, and occasional fruit were included when available. These meals were distributed at predictable times, forming part of the daily schedule. Beyond sustenance, they offered moments of social connection, informal storytelling, and laughter. Food was both nourishment and subtle reward, a small relief within a day otherwise dominated by repetitive physical exertion. Perhaps most revealing are the games and informal competitions that peppered worksite life. These were not grand spectacles, but small contests of strength, coordination, or dexterity. Teams might compete to haul stones more efficiently, move heavier blocks, or perform tasks with greater precision. Informal wrestling matches or ball games were common during rest periods. These activities were recreational, yet they also enhanced work skills. They trained coordination, encouraged team cohesion, and allowed workers to display ability without jeopardizing the project. In essence, leisure was functional. It built camaraderie, sharpened physical capabilities, and maintained morale. Alongside games, there were moments of quiet artistic expression. As noted in Section 1, sketches on limestone flakes or mud surfaces provided subtle mental relief. Workers depicted animals, family members, gods, and even playful exaggerations of daily life. These images were often private, tucked away in corners or hidden on discarded stones, yet they survive today as a record of human curiosity and imagination. They remind us that even in the most repetitive environments, people seek avenues for expression, creativity, and mental engagement. Social structure reinforced these coping mechanisms. The files, or organized labor teams, were more than functional units. They were social networks. Senior workers guided younger men, while hierarchies allowed for conflict resolution and role assignment. Within these teams, informal mentoring occurred. Techniques for carving, lifting, or balancing blocks were taught orally, supplemented by demonstration. Learning was ongoing and communal. The combination of rotation, hierarchy, and mentorship mitigated monotony, spread skills, and maintained morale in a workforce under enormous physical strain. The worksite also functioned as an educational environment. Young apprentices observed and assisted experienced craftsmen, absorbing techniques not just for immediate tasks, but for lifelong skills. Carpentry, stone cutting, metalwork, and masonry were all taught in situ. Even games, competitions, and artistic exercises had educational value, teaching strategy, spatial reasoning, and coordination. The pyramid, therefore, was not only a monumental tomb, it was a school, a workshop, and a communal home, all in one. Health and hygiene remained critical to sustaining productivity and leisure. Regular medical care, including treatments for injuries, muscle strains, and infections, ensured that laborers could continue working. Footwear, tools, and work rotations reduced wear and tear. These practical measures also allowed men to experience small pleasures. A brief nap, a moment of shade, or a shared joke, without the immediate threat of injury or exhaustion. Comfort, even in modest forms, reinforced human resilience and mental stability in a harsh environment. Another subtle but important factor was psychological preparation for monumental work. The scale of the pyramid could have been overwhelming, yet workers approached it incrementally. Each block placed, each measurement verified, each haul completed, became part of a larger rhythm. Tasks were divided into manageable units, punctuated by communal meals, games, or brief rest. The pyramid was constructed not by sheer labor alone, but by cumulative human effort sustained through careful organization, morale management, and the embedding of minor pleasures into daily routines. These small interventions, games, rituals, skill sharing, and communal meals were forms of behavioral resilience, enabling workers to endure repetitive, physically taxing tasks for long periods. They reveal the sophistication of ancient Egyptian labor organization. The pharaohs, architects, and overseers understood that human motivation and endurance were as critical as physical logistics. Monumental achievement required attention to psychology as well as mechanics, and the survival strategies of workers were integral to project success. Yet, even in this structured environment, uncertainties persisted. Floods, disease, political shifts, or supply disruptions could interrupt the work cycle. When rations were delayed, illness spread, or leadership changed, the system was strained. It is in these moments of tension that the informal, human aspects of work, games, small rituals, communal solidarity were most important. They were buffers against instability. Subtle yet essential strategies for preserving cohesion and productivity. The worker's ability to adapt, find enjoyment, and maintain skill under pressure is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of life at the pyramid base. And still, many questions linger, subtle but persistent. How much of this daily adaptation was consciously recognized by the workers themselves? Were these small acts of leisure, artistry, and ritual deliberate survival strategies, or instinctive human responses to repetitive labor? Which routines were lost to time, erased because they were mundane, private, or considered insignificant by record keepers? These unresolved questions highlight the limits of historical knowledge. What survives are fragments, inscriptions, ostraca, food remnants, and architectural evidence. Yet these fragments, when considered together, reveal a sophisticated human ecosystem, one in which labor, recreation, skill, ritual, and social cohesion were interwoven. The pyramid, therefore, is not only a monument to pharaonic authority, it is a testament to human endurance, ingenuity, and the capacity to carve out meaning and joy within extreme repetition. In the next section, we will explore how these survival strategies and small leisure practices culminated in enduring skills, social cohesion, and subtle cultural contributions, and how the seemingly monotonous routines of pyramid workers shaped not just monumental construction, but the human story of resilience in ancient Egypt. As you follow the daily life of pyramid workers to its final stage, it becomes clear that the seemingly repetitive labor hauling, cutting, and positioning limestone blocks was only one dimension of their existence. Equally important were the small acts of endurance, creativity, and social cohesion that allowed human beings to operate at the limits of physical and mental strain. These routines were not incidental. They were carefully adapted to the demands of survival, morale, and collective achievement. By examining the interplay between labor, leisure, and resilience, we begin to understand the deeper human narrative behind one of history's most famous monuments. The first insight comes from endurance and physical adaptation. The laborers' bodies were conditioned over time. Muscle memory developed through repeated lifting, cutting, and sledging. Teams rotated tasks to balance fatigue and prevent injury, and foremen meticulously planned workloads to optimize output. Yet even within these carefully structured routines, the human body required breaks, moments to rest, stretch, or simply observe the surrounding landscape. These brief pauses were essential, not just for physical survival, but for mental stability. The desert's monotony, the blinding sun, and the enormous scale of the pyramid could otherwise overwhelm even the strongest men. In these moments of stillness, workers found glimpses of quiet reflection, small entertainments, and social connection. Consider, for instance, artistic expression embedded within labor. Workers etched sketches into limestone fragments or mud surfaces during downtime. Many of these images depicted familiar animals, humorous exaggerations of daily tasks, or small symbolic motifs. They were rarely intended for official record. They were personal expressions, little windows into individual creativity. In a culture dominated by monumental scale, these micro-level sketches reveal that ordinary people actively sought ways to leave traces of themselves in the world. They demonstrate that even in extreme monotony, human ingenuity persisted. The act of creating, however modest, was both therapeutic and socially reinforcing, providing mental stimulation and a subtle sense of accomplishment. Another dimension was skill, transfer, and mentorship. Apprentices learned techniques directly from experienced masons, carpenters, and stonecutters. The transfer was oral, observational, and hands-on. A system optimized for cumulative knowledge retention. Even minor competitions or games had educational value. Tossing a ball could improve hand-eye coordination. Lifting a weighted block with precision could develop strength and spatial awareness, and collaborative tasks reinforced teamwork. These informal learning moments were as critical to the pyramid's completion as formal labor schedules. They reveal a subtle but profound strategy. Recreation and work were intertwined, producing both efficiency and resilience. Social cohesion further amplified the workers' endurance. Life at the base of the pyramid was highly communal. Meals were shared, shifts were coordinated, and leisure activities, songs, storytelling, ball games, or wrestling, were collective experiences. Within these communal structures, interpersonal bonds flourished. Workers celebrated small victories, supported those injured or fatigued, and reinforced the hierarchy of experience and skill. These social networks were critical to maintaining morale. In an environment where failure could result in injury or exhaustion, cohesion was as important as individual ability. Through these social bonds, the pyramid became more than a construction site. It was a carefully managed human ecosystem. Rituals and spiritual practices further sustained the workforce. Laborers frequently carried amulets, offered small sacrifices, or engaged in prayers before and during tasks. Such practices, though seemingly minor, offered psychological stability and comfort. By invoking protection from gods, they transformed dangerous or strenuous work into structured, meaningful action. Even simple gestures, a sketch of a protective animal, the placing of a small token near a tool, imbued routine labor with a sense of purpose beyond immediate survival. The combination of endurance, skill, leisure, mentorship, and ritual produced what historians might call behavioral resilience. Workers were equipped not only with the physical strength to lift stones, but with the social, emotional, and cognitive strategies to persist under stress. Their lives were regulated yet adaptable, highly structured yet filled with subtle flexibility. This interplay ensured that the pyramid could be completed across decades. Despite the inherent monotony, environmental challenges, and physical strain, from a modern perspective, these strategies offer a striking lesson in human adaptability. We often assume that monumental achievements depend solely on engineering, leadership, or technology, but in the case of the pyramids, success hinged equally on human endurance, morale management, and the cultivation of small, personal, and social coping mechanisms. Games, sketches, communal meals, mentorship, and ritual were not trivial. They were essential components of a functioning workforce. This leads to another reflection. The workers themselves, despite anonymity, shaped the monument as much as the pharaoh or architect. Their creativity, problem-solving, and subtle innovations left an indelible mark. When historians analyze the precision of stone placement, the alignment of passages, or the durability of the structure, it is not just a triumph of design, it is the cumulative result of countless ordinary individuals applying extraordinary discipline, ingenuity, and quiet endurance. The pyramid is both a monument to the pharaoh and a testament to the daily lives of those who built it. Yet even as you consider their contributions, you are reminded of the limits of historical record. Most of what we know comes from ostraka, administrative documents, and archaeological evidence. Personal details, private thoughts, jokes, fears, or frustrations are largely lost. What we see are traces of routine, brief sketches, and remnants of communal activity. The true texture of daily life is partially hidden, leaving us to reconstruct mental and social landscapes with careful inference. In this sense, the pyramid workers themselves remain partly mysterious, their inner experiences quietly concealed beneath millennia of stone and dust. Still, the fragments that survive reveal a profound insight. Human resilience is not solely a product of circumstance, but of adaptive behavior. Workers learn to balance labor with leisure, repetition with creativity, hierarchy with camaraderie, and survival with psychological relief. They understood implicitly or explicitly that endurance requires both structure and flexibility. These lessons, though encoded in a labor force from 4,500 years ago, remain relevant today. They remind us that large projects, sustained effort, and monumental achievement rely not only on design and leadership, but on the lived experiences, coping strategies, and small daily decisions of ordinary people. In the end, the story of pyramid workers is both humbling and inspiring. These were men whose names are mostly lost, whose individual lives were ephemeral, yet whose collective actions produced one of humanity's most enduring achievements. Their daily routines, mundane, repetitive, physically taxing, were transformed through creativity, social cohesion, skill mastery, and ritual into a sustainable system that endured decades. Even in the harshest conditions, they found moments of play, artistic expression, and human connection. And perhaps this is the final lesson of their story. Great history is often built not only by extraordinary individuals, but by ordinary people navigating ordinary lives with resilience, ingenuity, and subtle joy. The Great Pyramid, timeless and monumental, stands as a testament not only to pharaonic ambition, but to the quiet, enduring, and often overlooked human strategies that make survival, productivity, and legacy possible. When most people think of ancient Egypt, their minds immediately conjure grand monuments, golden tombs, and pharaohs adorned in dazzling regalia. What is far less often considered is the quieter, more intimate side of life. The presence of animals in the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians. From dogs and cats to monkeys, birds, and even fish, animals were not simply utilitarian. They were companions, playmates, and participants in domestic and ritual life. Examining these relationships reveals a dimension of Egyptian society that is both mundane and profoundly human, a tapestry of care, amusement, and survival that has often been overshadowed by monumental history. You might imagine walking through a typical Egyptian village. The sun has risen above the Nile, reflecting off mud brick walls, and the slow-moving waters of irrigation channels. Children run across open courtyards, kicking up dust. Nearby, a dog stretches in the morning sun, wagging its tail at the sight of its owner. Chickens cluck and scratch at the ground for grains scattered by a caretaker. Cats patrol the edges of the house, alert for rats or snakes. These animals are integrated into the rhythms of human life, providing both practical benefits and emotional companionship. Cats, perhaps more than any other animal, occupied a special place in Egyptian society. Not merely the sacred symbols often depicted in temples, cats were common domestic companions for families of various social strata. They were celebrated for their ability to control vermin, but they also held an affectionate role. Owners would feed them milk or small portions of fish, and sometimes even dress them in decorative collars or amulets. Archaeological evidence suggests that cats were often buried alongside their owners or in designated cemeteries, indicating a recognition of their significance in both life and afterlife. The bond between humans and cats was therefore not purely functional. It was relational, emotional, and socially meaningful. Dogs, on the other hand, were versatile companions. They were used for hunting, guarding property, and assisting in herding livestock. Yet, beyond these tasks, they were also cherished for loyalty and play. Pet dogs might accompany owners on walks, join children in games, or rest near household members. Some inscriptions depict dogs in domestic scenes, sitting patiently beside furniture or interacting with their human caretakers. Training appears to have been informal, yet consistent. Commands and gestures guided the animal's behavior, while play and reward reinforced positive interactions. Through these practices, Egyptians shaped the personalities and skills of their pets, creating relationships that were interactive rather than purely hierarchical. Monkeys, often imported from Nubia or captured locally, were less common but provided both amusement and utility. Their dexterity and curiosity made them playful companions, capable of mimicking simple human behaviors. Families kept monkeys in small cages or enclosed spaces, and they were sometimes trained to retrieve objects or perform tricks. While the historical record is less extensive for monkeys than for cats and dogs, their presence reflects a broader human tendency to cultivate curiosity and entertainment alongside practical domestic care. Observing the interaction between children and monkeys offers a vivid glimpse into the pleasures and small social hierarchies of ordinary households. Birds, too, were integral to domestic and ritual life. Ducks, geese, and pigeons were kept both as food sources and as companions. Songbirds were especially valued for their melodious contributions to household ambience. Wealthier households sometimes displayed small aviaries, allowing birds to fly within limited spaces while offering daily care and feeding. Bird feathers were occasionally used in rituals, clothing, or artistic decoration, further integrating the avian into human culture. Feeding, observing, and even training birds formed a quiet daily rhythm for many Egyptians, blending utility with sensory enjoyment. Animals also had a direct influence on labor and survival. Dogs aided in herding goats or protecting fields. Cats preserved food supplies by keeping grain stores free from rodents. Geese provided meat and eggs. The human-animal relationship was thus both emotional and functional. Egyptians understood that companionship could coincide with practical benefit, creating relationships that were mutually reinforcing. The presence of animals provided entertainment, emotional solace, and assistance, forming a multi-dimensional aspect of ordinary life that historians often overlook. Interestingly, some evidence points to ritualized or ceremonial roles for domestic animals. Cats and other creatures could be dedicated to gods, participating in temple life, or symbolic observances. Such rituals elevated everyday pets into the sacred realm, linking domestic care with spiritual practice. A family cat, for instance, might be adorned with small charms or placed in temple offerings, recognizing its protective or symbolic value. Animals thus straddled both private and public spheres, reflecting the intertwined nature of utility, affection, and religious meaning. Health and care were also notable. Animals were given attention comparable to that of family members, at least in higher status households. Veterinary care included herbal remedies, bandaging minor injuries, and providing appropriate diets. While the majority of animals might have received only minimal attention due to resource constraints, the survival of any animal depended on routine observation and intervention. Even in modest households, feeding schedules, play periods, and simple cleaning